Welcome to another episode of Houshivar podcast. I'm Mehdi Shafa, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking with one of the most original and profound voices in contemporary science writing, Dr. Philip Ball. Dr. Philip Ball, welcome to the Houshivar podcast.
Thank you.
So before I start my question, I would like to read a brief introduction to Dr. Ball, as written in the back of the book. Dr. Ball is a free-lane writer and broadcaster whose many books on the interactions of the science, the arts, and the wider culture include Bright Earth, Curiosity, Patterns in Nature, How to Grow a Human, The Modern Myths, The Elements, and most recently, The Book of Minds, all also published by University of Chicago Press. His book, Critical Mass, won the 2005 Aventis Prize for Science Books. Ball is also the 2022 recipient of the Royal Society's Wilkins Bernal Medover Medal for contribution to the history, philosophy, or social roles of science. He trained as a chemist at the University of Oxford and as a physicist at the University of Bristol, and he was an editor at Nature for more than 20 years. He lives now, I guess, still in London, correct?
That's right. Yes.
Okay. So, and also before I start, I would like to also read one of the praises of the book for the English version is in the back from Siddhartha Mukherjee, the author of The Song of the Cell and the Pulitzer Prize winning of Emperor of the Maladies. Ball's marvelous book is both wide-ranging and deep. It explores the fundamental machines of biology and leaves the reader full of awe and wonder. And also James Shapiro, the author of Evolution, Ball has the rare ability to explain scientific concepts across very diverse disciplines. In this book, he employs that understanding to introduce the readers to the profound changes taking place in the life science. So it's longer. I don't want to read, but for the audience who know, you can buy this. I put a link to the Amazon. Okay, sorry, you can see maybe. And also, we are already translated this book. Thank you, Dr. Ball, to give us the permission. We already translated this book to Farsi. It's in the final stage of publishing. And for Iranian audience, they can maybe buy and read it. It's a fantastic book. I am, as a biologist, also learned a lot. So for the first question, Dr. Ball, I would like to start with the first chapter. So you talk about the machine, escaping the machine metaphor. That's something that you criticize for a long time. In biology, we look at the living organism as machine. You open the book with this. What has the mechanistic imaginary been so persistent in biology? Why so long it was there, but now we have to move beyond the machinery concept in biology?
I think the metaphor has been there at least since the Enlightenment in the West. So it has a long tradition. We really sort of found it coming out, for example, in the thinking of Descartes, René Descartes in the 17th century, who saw, as many of his contemporaries did, saw the human body as a sort of contraption of levers and moving parts, and you could understand it using mechanics, using Isaac Newton's mechanics. So this was the thinking at the time, and that's persisted ever since. And one reason it's persisted is because there's a lot of truth in it. That actually, we can understand certainly the movement of an arm is like a lever, and we can think about all the mechanics of that in the same way as we do for a machine. So there is some sense to it. The heart we can think of as being a bit like a pump. The eye, it has optics in the same way as lenses do and telescopes do. So, I don't want to suggest that the metaphor is totally inappropriate, but what I say in this book is that once we get down to the real details of what it is that makes living matter different from non-living matter, from a coffee cup, say, then the answer, so far as we have an answer at the moment, the answer seems to be, and seems increasingly to be, that it works nothing like any machine we have ever made. Um, so, that's really the purpose of a metaphor, that a metaphor is meant to sort of give you a way of thinking about something that's less familiar in terms of something that's more familiar. But so when we think about machines, we think about levers and cogs, and perhaps these days we might think about computers as well. But none of those have operational principles that are similar to the way life works. No, I qualify that in the book too, because again, even right down at the level of cells and molecules, there are some instances where thinking about what's going on in terms of machines can still be useful. For example, we have these little molecules called proteins that make our bodies work, that carry out all of the biochemical processes that our bodies need. And some of those really do seem to be a bit like little machines. There are proteins that stick in the walls of our cells and spin round, and they're sort of powered by hydrogen ions, and they spin round just like a sort of motor in a kind of bracket. So there, it seems like the machine metaphor is not unreasonable. But once we start to think about how all of these components work together, then becomes, it seems less and less like a machine. I've heard it said, it's been said to me actually, that one reason why biologists still like to stick with the machine metaphor is that some of them see it as distinguishing the way we try to understand life from the old view that was called vitalism, where there was some kind of mystic force, really, some life force that imbued living matter and that made it, intrinsically different from non-living matter. The more we understood about biology and biochemistry, the less that idea seemed to have any validity, and the less explanatory power it seemed to have. And that the idea of vitalism was more or less banished in the 19th century for good reason. But so some people think we've got to stick with this machine metaphor because the alternative is to go back to this mystical idea of vitalism. And what I want to try to persuade people of in this book is it really isn't. We can let go of the idea that we explain everything like a machine, and we try to explain it in its own terms. Terms that don't require any kind of mysticism, any kind of life force, terms that are basically at the lowest level a matter of physics and chemistry. But nevertheless, those operational principles are ones that seem to me to be quite unique to biology.
Thank you. I will come back to that later. I have a question about the intelligent design. You talk in your book in some parts that because um, at the Iranian, this concept of the religion and also this mysticism is very powerful in some people, and I would like to hear about that, but I leave it for later. But
Mhm.
for the second question, so I would like to talk about the DNA. Your first chapter, second chapter, I guess, starts with DNA. This is one of the striking message in your book that DNA is not a blueprint or instruction manual. So you emphasize on this in different parts of the book. Last week, I was talking to Professor Pluming about the blueprint, the book that he has written. And then I asked some of the criticism that you had in the book, and he answered. I will send you a link to that episode if you want. You can listen. He agreed with most of the things that you emphasize in the book. And he was telling me that he's talking about the 1% difference that people have, not the 99% that DNA works in evolution. So I send you the link if you want, you can listen. But I think you still criticize the belief of looking at the life as DNA, at the blueprint or instruction manual, and you look at the different levels and interactions between all of these levels. So why you think is still the genetic program metaphor? It's another metaphor that we use. It's so hard to abandon, and it's popular, but it's hard to abandon even among scientists.
Well, it arose. I mean, it was a peculiar coincidence, but it made it inevitable that this metaphor was going to rise, I think, because it arose at the beginnings of molecular biology when we first discovered what the DNA molecule actually looks like at the atomic level. So this was in 1953. It was the work of Francis Crick and James Watson, drawing on Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins and other people's work. And it looked remarkably like DNA was like one of the magnetic tapes that was starting to be used to store information in binary code in computers. These were the very, very early days of computers. That was how we stored information. I mean, I'm old enough to remember actually having my programs on a reel of magnetic tape. And so, it seemed like this metaphor was too good to pass by. It would just seemed amazing that because clearly the structure of DNA, the fact that it is this string of little chemical units joined together, four different units rather than just ones and zeros. But it's still a code of some sort that encodes information. And it seemed then that that information is the information required to build us. And all we have to do is to read out that information on DNA. Um, so it made perfect sense to draw that analogy and to think of DNA as having this kind of as being this kind of encoding of all the information needed to make us. Um, there's various problems with that. I mean, one of them is that you can have all that information there, but you're never going to make anything out of it unless you actually put it into something that is already alive. DNA never becomes, I mean, DNA is an inert molecule. It's a chemical molecule. It never does anything by itself. Even if you put it in a test tube in water and throw at it all the other things that we think life involves, amino acids and lipids and all the rest of it, still nothing is going to happen. It's not going to assemble, a living thing. DNA has to be in something that is already alive, a cell, in order for it to propagate life. But I think that my criticism about seeing it as a blueprint is that, again, we have to respect what metaphors are about. A blueprint, when you look at a blueprint, you kind of have a picture of the thing you're going to build. You can make sense of it straight away. You can think, oh, okay, that's a rocket or that's a car or whatever. That's not the case with DNA. That we have decoded, we have figured out what all of those letters are. There are 3 billion of them along the entire length of human DNA. We've figured what those letters are. That was what the Human Genome Project did from about 1990 to the early 2000s. And yet, you could not deduce, if you had the genome sequence of, let's say, a dog or a human, you could not deduce what kind of organism that is going to give rise to. You simply could not do that. It's not a matter of just having not having enough computational power. We've got plenty of computational power these days. That information is not in there. That the form and the shape and the reality, the what we was called the phenotype, including all the traits of organisms, are things that develop during embryogenesis. They are brought about. The DNA is essential in that process. If you don't have it, it's not going to happen. But the DNA does not encode that. This is very, very clear, I think, now from molecular biology, from what we understand about genetics. Um, and so, it's simply the wrong metaphor. We need a better way of thinking about DNA. And what I suggest in the book, and what I generally suggest now, is that DNA, it is a code. It is encoding something. It is encoding information. What it encodes are possible structures of molecules, particularly proteins, but also other kinds of molecule that the cell uses, that the living thing uses in order to make more cells, in order to divide, in order to propagate. So DNA is a source of molecular resources. And those molecular resources, it's not even sort of prescribed what they're going to be used for. So cells will use their DNA differently in different circumstances. For example, in the different tissues of our body, the way the cells of those tissues make use, sometimes the way they make use of a single gene to make a protein is different. They make a slightly different protein because they're taking in information about what kind of cell they are, what kind of tissue they're in. So some of the information comes from outside. And so the key consideration really is that living things are and have to be open informational systems. They have to be taking information from higher levels of the system itself and from their broader environment, as well as making use of the information in DNA. That's why I think it's the blueprint is simply the wrong metaphor these days.
Thank you. As a cell biologist, also we work to differentiate stem cells, yes, in the lab. So you mentioned is about the space and time in the book as well. So how you put these cells together, how they interact with each other, is not written in the DNA directly. So they interact. You control the pH, you control the oxygen, you control everything, and with small changes, they go to different lineages in the lab. So these are also very important, and how you describe this as a like a differentiation of the cells from the egg toward the tissues as well as the organs. I highly recommend to for audience to read these is different layers Dr. Ball discussed from the DNA going to RNA to protein, to tissues and organs. So you may know I have also translated the recent book of Richard Dawkins, The Genetic Book of the Dead. So you talk about there's a part in the, I think, first chapter or second chapter about geneticization, about the gene-centric view versus the system-centric view. So you know what Richard Dawkins' view is. And also in this book, most of it is aligned with what you are mentioning, so it's not different, but he pays attention to genes as a center of the evolution or natural selection. I come to that as the last question because you discuss about this at the end of the book. But I would like to also talk to Professor Sapolsky. He's also looking at the reductionist view, so to the brain. He's a neuroscientist, but about the causality. So you talk about the causality in the book as well. You, Professor, like Dr. Kevin Mitchell, or similar to you think also the causality is not only top bottom up. So there's also top down. Or I would like to ask you, because it's a hot discussion among the scientists as well as in Iranian communities. First of all, do we still have the causal power like in physics? So some people like they think about quantum physics, they think maybe causality is not as strong as before. This is my first question, how you think about the causality in physics and biology, as well as how the causality works. Is the bottom up, or now we think also the other layers of the life also affect the bottom? Because it's important about every aspect we think about life.
Yes. I'll start by saying I think causation is key to understanding, in particular, how biology works, how life works, but also it's very, very difficult. Philosophers have argued and still argue about exactly how to understand causation
Yes,
and what it
exactly.
means. So it's a very slippery concept. But, having said that, I think there is now very good, clear evidence that in systems that have any sort of complexity, and that's what we live in, and that's what we are, causation doesn't necessarily have to come all from the lowest levels up. And so, what causes our behavior is not our genes. Our genes influence that for sure. Our genes influence the way our brains wire up. They don't determine it. They couldn't determine it because we have something like 86 billion neurons and even more connections between those, and we only have 20,000 genes. There's not enough information to prescribe what our brains look like, but for sure they bias the way our brains wire up. So, genes have an influence, that is certain, but they are not the only causal factors in how things happen. And this idea, there are, for some strange reason that I don't really grasp, there are plenty of scientists, including actually a lot of physicists, and I trained as a physicist, there are a lot of physicists who really don't like this idea of top-down causation, that causes can come from the top down rather than the bottom up. So, they have this idea that actually at the lowest level there are only, or either a lower level still, but at the lowest level we tend to think about, there are just atoms and molecules interacting through forces that we understand. And, that's at the root of everything. And it's true, that is at the root of everything, but that doesn't mean it's the cause of everything. And in a way, it feels to me that this is a trivial thing, but it's also quite a profound thing. That if I lift up my cup, those atoms of the cup have been moved. What has moved them? The physicists might say, well, it's the forces generated in my arm by all sorts of molecular processes happening there, and it's the impulses in my brain that sort of did this. It's the ions going in and out of neurons and all the rest of it. You will not find, if you look into those systems at those details, you will never find the cause of that. And the reason is the cause of this cup going up is a thought, is an idea. it's happening at that level, that integrated level in my brain that I have decided, in a meaningful sense, there is a meaningful sense in which I have decided to lift the cup up. And that has moved matter. A thought has moved matter. It's amazing, but actually, it's what happens all the time. And we have to address things at the right causal level. So, for a big thing like this, atoms can't move that. Ions moving around can't move that. It has to be something that is operating at a higher causal level, which comes down to ideas and impulses and desires in my brain that give rise to something like that. So, I think it's an uncontroversial idea that this can happen. And in biology, it's actually essential that you talked about Richard Dawkins' book, which I reviewed actually for Science Magazine, and it's as are all his books. It's absolutely beautifully written. There are wonderful things in it, and Richard is very insistent on this gene-centered view of evolution. And in my book, I'm not saying that is wrong. I'm saying that is a particular way of understanding a particular process in biology. If you are an evolutionary population geneticist, thinking in terms of, genes and genes being selfish and genes being in competition, is a very useful way to do it. It's a kind of a metaphor for the models, the mathematical models that they use to understand how different variants of genes spread through a population. That's fine. That does not tell you how life works. That does not tell you how our bodies work. And it never will. You have to have a different way of thinking about genes. And in fact, people now quite regularly recognize that what is meant in evolution by a gene is not really the same thing as what is meant in developmental biology and embryology as a gene. Those are really sort of different concepts, and how either of them relate to an actual bit of DNA is actually complex as well. It's not at all straightforward. So I think that's how I would respond to the Dawkins sort of gene-centric view, that it's fine for a particular purpose. It would be a mistake to think that tells us what genes are and what genes do.
Thank you so much. So let's move on. So you talk about different words or concepts in your book coming from emergence, from autonomy, from purposeness, having purpose, the life entities, they have purpose. This sometimes cause misunderstanding in the public as well. So they bring a outside power to the concept of life. So I would like to go first of all, how the emergence is working in life science. So we have emergence in other aspects of the field science like physics, or even I have recently talked to my friends. He's a sociologist, so he talks about emergence as well in the social, in the people and population. So first of all, what is the meaning of emergence, and you discuss in your book, and how important is uh, the emergence in life science now?
Mhm. Um, this is another concept that people get quite fraught about,
Yeah.
the idea of emergence, and for some good reason, because sometimes it's thrown about as a very woolly term as though it's just sort of hand waving to explain something. But actually, I think there is quite a precise way to understand it, and it's not a new idea in physics. It is for physicists like me. These are ideas that go back at least to the late 19th century. I studied as what's called a condensed matter physicist, which is basically the physics of stuff we can actually see and touch, liquids and solids and how they work. Their emergence is absolutely central. The idea that the fact that you get a liquid state from lots of molecules interacting together. They don't just kind of necessarily freeze and pack into a solid or just sort of disperse into the air. You get liquids in between them. That is an emergent property. Any state of matter is an emergent property. And the fact that if you cool water down until it freezes, suddenly it all freezes at once. When you get to the freezing point, it all goes at once. It's just a bit above, it's liquid, just a bit below, it's ice, and there's nothing in between. That is called in physics, it's called a phase transition, and it's an emergent behavior but by which I mean that it is due to the cooperative interactions of many, many particles that you'd never deduce that that was going to happen just by looking at a single water molecule. You couldn't tell from a single water molecule whether that was going to be, in a gas or a liquid or whatever. You couldn't tell the states it might have. But when you put a lot of them together, then you get this emergent behavior. It's something that we're all familiar with in life. There is strong emergent behavior in road traffic, for example. When it gets dense enough, then sometimes it will kind of freeze into a jam, like a kind of a traffic solid. But you also get these more complex emergent behaviors where you might get sort of waves of jams and then it clears and then it jams again and it clears. You get these very complex behaviors that you can only deduce by looking at all the whole system of all these interacting components. So that's really the idea of emergence, that there are phenomena that arise at a higher level through the interactions of many of the components, and that you can't deduce by looking at any of those components individually. So that's in one way that's a clear idea, but in another way it's kind of a mysterious one, because what it implies is that there are some fine details of the system that don't matter anymore. It doesn't really matter exactly what all the water molecules are doing at 0 degrees. They're going to freeze anyway. So the fine details don't matter. You throw away fine detailed information, or the universe, if you like, throws away those details. It doesn't care about them. It just cares about something that's what physicists called coarse grained. That's something that not only do we find in life, but we have to find in life, that if all the fine details mattered in all of our cells, if every molecule had to be in exactly the right place, in exactly the right concentration to do its job, it's never going to work. It's like some incredibly elaborate clockwork mechanism where every single cog has to be in the right place. And in biology it's worse than that, because it's warm and it's wet and it's messy. So it's like having a mechanism like that you're putting in a bath and shaking around and still hoping it will work. That's never going to work. So for life to work, there has to be these emergent properties that don't care about the details, that are more robust than that. So, it's natural that we should find this property of emergence at various levels in biology, so that, different cells will work, even though in detail, every single cell will be different from any other. All the molecules will be in slightly different places, slightly different concentrations. That doesn't matter. They'll still behave as a particular kind of cell. The cells get together and will build a body, and our bodies tend to be look pretty much the same as one another, and that's a kind of a collaboration of cells building those things during embryogenesis. That too is an emergent sort of property that doesn't require every single cell to be doing exactly the right thing. So that's really what I mean by emergence in biology. It's how larger scale structures arise despite the fact that everything is very noisy and slightly random at the fine grained level.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. So this is also, you talk about the reductionist view in science as well as the holistic view or system biology. System biology, I think, is not much old. It's like a 20, 30, 40 years old. It's not new. Even I am not trained in system biology. I had a like, kind of reductionist view. What I have done so far, I came across this system biology last few years. Now, what you mentioned is also true for the reductionist view in science, not only in biology, also in physics or also in other aspects, is the same almost. It's not enough to explain the behavior.
It's not enough to explain the behavior, but it's essential for us to be
Mm,
able to have any hope of
mm,
doing that.
I think so.
You sometimes hear about these two views of biology being opposed to one another. One is reductionist. You go looking at the details of the individual molecules, you figure out the structure of the proteins, you figure out the sequence of the genes. The other is you try to understand the whole organism. There's a whole kind of movement in biology of what's the word they use it? Organicism. That tries to sort of take into account the whole organism, and that has tended to be sort of relegated for a long time as everyone got excited about the molecules and what the molecules were doing and being able to understand them and having these techniques to understand them. But I always find this a bit of an unnecessary thing to suggest that there is some conflict between these. I actually think we need both of those. We absolutely need to understand the fine details, the reductionist details. What has been really extraordinary and exciting to me to see over the past 2 or 3 decades is how those two views, the sort of more holistic view of the whole thing working as an integrated whole, and the reductionist view, how they have come together. And I mean that in the sense that the more we understand about those molecular details, particularly in complex organisms like us, the more I think we can see that it's not, again, it's not like this machine-like sort of clockwork. It's not like these kind of, computer programs that have can only sort of play out one way. Those molecular details have been selected through evolution so that they can support precisely the kind of emergent behavior that we see in organisms. So, for example, we used to think of of protein enzymes as being like little machines, like molecules that have a very particular shape, and it's a shape that will only fit another molecule that it's meant to sort of fit and transform in some way. And all the other molecules don't fit, and so it ignores them all. And that's how things work. Well, sometimes, that does seem to be a reasonable way of thinking about it. But for a lot of our proteins, in particular, for some of those that are most important, in our biology, things that control the cell cycle, the replication of cells. For example, the proteins aren't like that. They don't have a fixed shape like that. They're much more floppy, or as biochemists say, they're intrinsically disordered. And so they're less selective about what they stick to. And they can stick to all sorts of different partners and can adapt themselves. That creates much more sort of robustness and ability to innovate, and ability to find a solution, in different circumstances, which is precisely what life needs in order to be able to carry on working in the face of all this kind of randomness that I talked about. So we can see in the structure of the proteins themselves, we can see a kind of an indication that life has designed them, if you like. We'll come onto that word later, but evolution, I would say, has designed them so that they are able to work in this versatile, slightly fuzzy, slightly floppy way that creates robustness for the whole organism. So I see these two ideas of the organism and the reductionism, the molecules, coming together to create a coherent story.
That's great. So, because of the sake of time, I have a few questions about the autonomy, the self-organization, as well as the agency. So they are not, they are related, but you describe them separately. So first of all, I would like to ask about autonomy and self-organization. So you describe living systems as autonomous entities that they create and sustain their own conditions for existence. What exactly does autonomy means in biology, and how does it differ from the traditional view that life is controlled by fixed genetic instruction? You mentioned about the genetic part, but what do you mean about autonomy and self-organization in a life system?
Right. Um, this is also
Yeah,
a complex notion
yes.
because because what it doesn't mean is organisms can just kind of survive, and fend for themselves. Actually, none of us can, and in fact, individual cells can't. If you grow a culture of cells, I mean, you'll know this, maybe if you grow a culture of cells and one of them gets detached, there's a good chance that the cell is just going to die. It's just going to, commit suicide, as we might sort of anthropomorphically put it, because that's what it's kind of, that's the default it will do if it doesn't have the inputs from all the other cells. So autonomy doesn't mean that. But what I mean is, autonomy is the ability of living organisms, whether it's cells or whether it's, organisms like us, to create their own agendas, to decide for themselves what they are going to do. So, this is something we do every day. And we have to do every day. There is no way that our genes can give us some kind of program to tell us how to respond to every situation that we're going to encounter. Every single day we encounter something we have never encountered before and our ancestors never encountered before. So actually to be alive, what you need to be able to do is to improvise on the spot when you're faced with that sort of problem. And even bacteria, to some degree, they're much, much simpler. And if you take them out of their normal environment, they usually die. But even they, to some degree, have to make decisions about what to do, in the face of the unpredictable environment that they might live in. So that's really what I mean by autonomy, that living systems are able to make those decisions, um, and they are able to do that not by just looking in the genome, looking up the answer, looking up the necessary thing they have to do in the genome, because it cannot possibly do that. What the genome has to do is to help in the construction of this entity that is autonomous. And as I say, it provides resources for doing that, but it's the entity itself that is making that decision. So it's taking in information from its surroundings. It's actually taking in information selectively. It doesn't sort of pay attention to everything. We don't pay attention to everything. There's all kinds of things, wavelengths our eyes can't see. So it takes in information selectively, it integrates it in some way, and it reaches a decision on the basis of that. That's something that I think is better seen as more like a kind of cognition than a computation. And that's why I kind of think cognition is a good metaphor for thinking about life quite generally, even at the level of bacteria. It doesn't mean bacteria have some kind of consciousness or awareness. There are people who argue that they might, but I don't see how that, I don't find a meaningful way to think about that. But I think that all living things, down to single cells, work in a way that is kind of cognitive.
Yes, thank you. Let's relate this to the agency. You quoted Dr. Kevin Mitchell as well in your book. I'm waiting for his permission also to talk about his book, as well as I'm already invited him to talk. So we are also in the same ideas that you have to the life. So you use this agency boldly in your book. What does it mean if you relate this to the autonomy as well as the purposeness that the life entities they have? What is the definition of the agency that you want to more biologists think about the agency, which is a word that sometimes biologists they avoid to use, or even the purpose. There are other things come to the word, but how you want to biologists know about this agency? What's your definition of agency? You
Yeah.
mentioned in the book.
Right. Well, yes, no, agency does make some biologists feel nervous. Again, I it's not too clear to me why, except that I think for some people it's associated with consciousness, with awareness, with making a deliberate decision, which you can't easily imagine something like a bacterium doing. But for me, agency is not that. It's something simpler or something more primitive, you could say, and it is the ability to alter yourself, the organism, and your environment, the organism's environment, in order to try to attain some kind of goal. And it's some kind of goal that the organism has set for itself. So agency is totally intimately related to the idea of goal directedness. Living things have goals. And, this is something that for many biologists hasn't been particularly controversial. I mean, the evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr, one of the most influential evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, was content, certainly by the end of his career, was very content to recognize that organisms are goal directed. They have things they want to do. Now, evolutionary biologists would say, well, all that's really saying is that living things try to survive and to replicate, to stay alive and to replicate. Um, and there's nothing mysterious about that. It's just what evolution sort of programs them to do, if you like. I think that's not enough. I don't think it's untrue, but it's not enough. I mean, sometimes it is actually untrue. Humans don't. Sometimes we choose not to replicate, not to reproduce. We very consciously choose that. Sometimes we choose not to survive. Um, so, there's clearly something going on in this kind of agent that can override that evolutionary directive, even though it's kind of there for, for most of us. But more to the point, that doesn't tell us what to do again in any particular situation. Those goals of reproducing and surviving aren't telling me what I should be saying now, how I should behave, be behaving now. There are all kinds of immediate, proximate goals that we have that are not kind of informed or defined by those evolutionary imperatives. When a rabbit is trying to escape from a fox, it's not thinking to itself, "I've got to survive." No, it's not thinking to itself, "I've got to reproduce." That's the thing I've got to do. So I've got to keep running because I've got to reproduce. It's just trying to escape. It just doesn't want to be eaten. In some very real sense, that is its goal in the moment. And the question then is, well, how does that work? How does an organism set those immediate goals? How does it choose which goals to set? How does the rabbit then decide I'm going to run this way or I'm going to run that way? I'm going to run like this or that. All of those things it has to decide. How does it do that? And how is that decision making, that agency, a very real agency, supported by, and how does it arise from what are in the end just molecules? That's the key issue, it seems to me, to understand what life is. That once we recognize living things are goal directed in a way that rocks, for example, are not, then the question is, where do those goals come from? How are they set? Evolution is, to my mind, a mechanism for producing goal-directed entities. It doesn't tell them what to do, as I say, in every circumstance. It makes them goal-directed. It makes them agents. It makes them intrinsically able to set their own goals in the moment. And so that's really the better question that we should be asking.
Thank you. Fantastic. So it comes to another question, which is also challenging, the intelligent design. I wrote this to ask you because um, and also relates to what we discussed about autonomy, agency, as well as many other aspects in biology. So supporters of intelligent design, you know that, often claim that life's complexity cannot arise without a designer. This designer is outside of the living world or physics. How does your work and the science that we know so far about life demonstrate that order or complexity that you talk in your book about different levels of complexity can emerge spontaneously? You talk about emergence as well. You can maybe clarify that one more time without any external plan or intelligence, because this is also important for Iranians. For many people, it's important, but because most of my audience are from Iran, so they can see what you are clearly thinking about this.
Well, first of all, in that respect, I would want to say that I don't consider that there is anything I've said in my book that need conflict with a religious belief. Um, I mean, you could have it or you don't have to have it. Either way, it's not what I say in the book
Mhm,
shouldn't be a problem for that.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
Um, the idea that, yeah, I mean, you're right. Of course, there is this long-standing idea that the complexity of life is just, too much to explain as something that could have spontaneously arisen. To my view, that argument has been settled long, long ago. We can see there have been. I mean, Richard Dawkins has been good at explaining this. We can see that there are very clear ways in which we can understand life having arisen through this process of evolution by natural selection and other processes. I should say, when we talk about evolution, there are, various nuances to it and various things going on. Natural selection seems to be one of the key drivers of evolution, but there are other aspects to it as well. But all of those things together, we can completely understand how they can give rise, and we can in fact see how they can give rise to complex systems. it's we there are all sorts of ways that we can not only see how that can happen, but we actually see it in action. You can see evolution happening, in terms of, for example, antibiotic resistance. We can see, a new bacteria arising that have this resistance in one way or another. That's just natural selection at work. So I don't think there's anything I've said that really adds to that idea that we, have an explanation for how things can be as complex as they are through the processes that we know happen in evolution, and we don't need to add anything to that. What I would say is that well, one thing I want to sort of get across in the book is that the more we look at living organisms, and particularly ourselves as complex living organisms, it could seem like the more complicated it becomes, and it just becomes a mass of details. And you think, crikey, how how can we ever sort of understand, how this happens? I think that over the past 20 or 30 years, we have started to see general principles that go beyond all these proliferating details that let us see how something this complex really can work. And as I say, at the molecular level, those principles seem to be ones that rely on a certain sort of fuzziness and a fuzziness combined with collective action of many things, not just one gene or one molecule doing one thing, but lots of them together doing a whole variety of things in a way that's quite sort of flexible and versatile. So I actually think that what we've understood from molecular and cell biology in the past 20 or 30 years has deepened that picture of our understanding of how complexity arises from you know totally naturalistic systems. It doesn't require any sort of somehow intelligent guidance beyond that.
Thank you so much. I have three more questions. Hopefully, in 15 minutes, we can finish. But before I go to the implication for evolutionary theory, like natural selection, I would like to ask this because it's important. Is some main concept in your book about the randomness noise inside the cells and also the living organism? You have written that these are not the flaw in vital ingredients. They are important for living system. You have many examples in your book. How can you explain these internal fluctuations? You talk about gene expression as well, or random gene expressions. They actually help organisms stay flexible, robust, and creative. These are random, but the living organism or the cells take advantage of these randoms. You talk about interactions of the molecules, and you have a picture in your book showing how messy is inside the cells. So how they find each other, how they interact is kind of noise and kind of randomness. So how can you explain this? Could you please elaborate a little bit this?
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, the randomness, at root, that a lot of that randomness comes from the fact that molecules are just sort of floating around in the cell, bumping into one another. There is just a lot of it's not a highly structured system in a lot of ways, and you can't control that, and cells can't control that. That's just the nature of how things are at the molecular scale. So if you're going to have something that works, it has to work in the face of that. But it's better than that. Well, when we talk about noise, that's kind of something that we don't want. That's a kind of negative word. It just gets in the way of things working properly. But actually, a bit of randomness can be really, really useful. If we think of just a salt cellar, for example, we turn it upside down. Sometimes the salt grains can just get sort of packed together, jammed together in the holes, and it doesn't flow out anymore. Give it a little shake and out it comes again. So randomness is a great way of not getting stuck in states that we don't really want to be stuck in. And that's really one of the ways that biology seems to, to use the randomness and the noisiness at the molecular scale. So that, for example, if two molecules kind of stick together and they're, that they're not a sort of useful union. They've just sort of stuck fairly randomly. They'll come apart again eventually because they're kind of shaking because of their temperature, their thermal noise, and that'll shake them apart again. And then they're free to go off and find the right partners. So randomness, can be this kind of noise can be really useful for not getting stuck in the wrong states. And we see many examples of the way biology uses that. But beyond that, even, it seems that sometimes biological systems are sort of designed by evolution to be in systems that are particularly kind of noisy. Our brains are like that. There's all these neurons firing all the time, and it seems that our brains, that firing of neurons, has a particular sort of structure to it in time that looks like what physicists call a critical state. This is one that is very close to going one way or the other, but it's kind of hovering in between. When that happens, the whole system is very sensitive to slight changes. And so something that sort of happens over here can propagate very quickly to something over here. And all the components of the system are kind of feeling what all the others are doing, which is not something that happens if it's further away and it's just kind of sitting there. So that again is a very useful way of getting information to spread quickly through a system. And it seems, that's the way our brains are set up. It also seems the way that some animal flocks and swarms work, that they are in a kind of critical state, so that if something happens over here, a predator comes over here, there's some kind of disturbance that very quickly propagates through the swarm. So, there are some situations where biology seems to have created systems that are actually designed to be random and to make use of that random in order to get things to happen and to get information around the system more quickly.
Thank you. My next question is about the evolution. Evolution. So this is the last part of your book. You talk about this during your book, but this is also the part that is already we don't know much. That what is the unit of natural selection? There are still genes, or there are other levels of the in the organism under natural selection. We know some epigenetic marks like non-coding RNAs, they can pass to next generation. So there are some papers recently published that some males that are under stress or trauma, so their sperm get changed, and some of these non-coding RNAs can move or transfer to the next generation. We don't know how many generations they stay, but there are some good evidence in worms or other animals, but not mammals. But I would like to hear you, this for the last part of your book, that still we don't know much. How, whatever you are showing in the book, it seems it's complementing the natural selection or the evolution theory by Darwin, but how you put this together, so how the other scientists should look, is we need a new theory for natural selection or Darwin's, or is it complementing what is the gene-centric view for natural selection?
Yeah, well, this is a question I'm really interested in, and I'm trying to follow up now. And I think it's a very complex and subtle one, and that we don't fully understand it. And I think in some ways, what it comes down to is once we recognize that living organisms are genuinely agents, they're not machines programmed by their genes to do a certain thing for the sake of the genes. They're not that. They are agents in their own right. Does that, or how does that, or how much does that change our picture of how evolution happens if we've looked at it from the sort of, gene-centric view? And I don't think there's any agreement about that yet. I mean, one thing is clear, that actually the agency of complex organisms like us is evolutionary important. There are situations, for example, where evolutionary biologists talk about behavioral drive as a driver of of evolutionary change. And by behavioral drive, they just mean organisms deciding to do something, deciding to, move over here rather than sort of foraging around there, deciding to find a new habitat, and then, finding ways to live in that habitat. That's agency at work, changing the course of evolution. And I don't think there's anything particularly controversial about that. The questions are often more about is agency actually primal? Does it have primacy in evolution? Is that really what's causing evolution to happen? The organisms deciding to do things for themselves. For example, organisms change their environment. They're not just at the mercy of what their environment gives them. We've changed our environment hugely, sometimes for the worse, but beavers change their environment. All sorts of organisms do. Some evolutionary biologists say, yeah, that's already in evolutionary theory. And absolutely, there are ways in which that has been thought about. Biologists call it niche construction or niche construction, as Americans would say. But the question is that enough? Or is there more to the way agency is directing the course of evolution in some way? These are really interesting questions that are still being debated. But I'm also very interested in the whole notion of being evolvable at all, of evolvability. How is it that organisms, if they are so finely tuned to their environment, and if the level of proteins and genes, they're finely tuned to do a particular job, how is it that you can get any kind of mutation to that system and it just doesn't all, fall apart? How does that? How is evolution still possible in organisms that are, that finely sort of attuned to their environment? So how are they evolvable? And this is a big, unfolding question at the moment. And I'm quite sure, I think there's good evidence for this now, that the kind of fuzziness and the kind of collectiveness that happens at the molecular level is how that is possible. That if you've got a bit of fuzziness there, you've got a bit of scope for change that isn't going to be catastrophic. Not only that, the way the different components interact together allows for the possibility that some little change to the fine structure of a protein or of exactly when the protein is produced, that can be sort of compensated for elsewhere in this network of interactions. So it can soak up this sort of mutational change and without it being catastrophic, until sometimes you get to a point where enough has changed that suddenly you get a dramatic change in the shape or the behavior of an organism, and you get these kind of sudden jumps in evolution. That seems to be exactly what does sometimes happen in evolution. So understanding the rules that govern the way things work at the molecular level does seem to have implications for how evolution happens itself, and in fact how evolution is even possible.
Thank you so much. My last question is one of the most important questions as well. So you have a chapter under rethinking medicine, chapter 10. So you talk about cancer, about personalized medicine or the future of medicine, and how during the last few decades, some of the treatments that we have for complex diseases is not as successful that we were expecting. So how the view that you are giving, and especially in this chapter, asking scientists or the researchers, they look at the life differently to develop new medications or new treatments for especially complex diseases. Could you please mention a little bit about your recommendation, how we look holistically to the living organisms for treatments?
Yeah, well, here I think the bottom line really for medicine is that if you want to effect some kind of change, if you want to put something right that's going wrong, then you are going to be most likely to do that if you intervene at the level at which that change or that defect or fault is being caused. So again, it's this question of causation. If the causation really is something, a mutation in a gene, and sometimes, we can reasonably think about it that way, then sure, the right thing to do then is to try to intervene at the genetic level. And we're seeing this happen, for example, for sickle cell disease, where it is a mutation of a particular gene that gives rise to this condition. And for some people, it's now possible to take blood cells out and to make a change to them, a genetic change using genome editing that will put that defect right, and then the cells are put back into the body. That's fantastic, but most diseases are not like that. Most diseases, they are associated with particular changes in genetics, but it's often in many different genes, and there are many different variants of all those associated genes, and it's really, really complicated. And in the end, I think what you're seeing there is a kind of echo in the genome of the actual causation of that disease, which is happening at a higher level, perhaps, for example, in the way the immune system is functioning. I mean, the immune system, it is implicated in so many, different diseases. And so it would make more sense to intervene at that higher level. And this seems to be certainly the case for cancer, that, that there was an idea 30, 40 years ago that we would find the genetic roots of cancer. We'd find out what the mutations are that are causing cancers, and then we'll go in and somehow fix them, or, figure out drugs that will hit those genes, and it'll all be fine. And that hasn't happened. Cancer treatments have become much better, but not because we've got better medicines for them. It's because we've got better diagnostic techniques. We've got better systems of, robotic operation to deal with cancers. We've got better imaging techniques. So we haven't got genetic medicine, for treating complex diseases like cancer in the way that was kind of implied when the Human Genome Project was being done. It was kind of implied this was going to revolutionize medicine in the sense of giving us new cures. It's transformed medicine in the sense of being able to tell how likely someone might be to get a disease, their vulnerabilities to disease based on genomic sequence, but it hasn't led to lots of cures. And I think that's because very often those diseases aren't arising. They're not genuinely caused at the genetic level. So we need to find a better level of intervention. So that's really the message there, that it comes down again to this issue of identifying what's causing the particular trait or phenotype or behavior that we're interested in.
Thank you so much. So I think it's a fantastic book. I'm eagerly waiting to be published, and all Iranian readers can read it. As a last question or closing remark, so you have been the Nature editor for more than 20 years, and you have received many papers for publication from the world. Um, what is your recommendation first for educators, for the people who are working in the science, especially biology, especially Iranian audience that are listening to you, as well as the Iranian scientists or biologists who are thinking about biology? What is your advice, thinking differently, the holistic view that you have, and how they can switch the research in a way that they can be more successful in the future from the view that you are mentioning in the book? So also bring your experience as the editor of the Nature as well.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I should probably first of all say that I was an editor at Nature many years ago, and
I know.
I've been a freelance for over 20 years now. So
Okay,
it was a while ago, but I did learn a
but
lot there about these sorts of issues. Um, for the specific question of understanding and communicating and educating in biology,
you know,
I think that we have to acknowledge first of all that if we find simple stories to tell, they're probably going to be wrong. It's a tricky thing because you need simple stories in education. You can't just throw all the details at students when they're beginning to learn. And, very often in physics, for example, a simple story will kind of be good enough when we learn about the Bohr atom, the atom with a, sort of solar system atom. That's good enough to sort of get the general view of what atoms are. But for genes, they're intrinsically complicated things, and if we try to give a simple story about them, particularly a simple causal story about them, then we're going to sow a misunderstanding, very early on. So I think we need to embrace really the complexity of life and the complexity of biology. But having said that, we don't, that doesn't mean, oh, there's no easy way. We just have to, give them all the horrible details. I think that we should begin by remembering what it is that we're trying to understand, that living organisms are so extraordinary, the diversity of them, the fact that they live in so many different ways, in so many different habitats, and they are so often so incredibly beautiful. I think that understanding biology should start there with a kind of wonder about how extraordinary living things are. We take it for granted, of course, because that's what we are. But the fact that atoms in the universe have come together to make something that is aware of itself and is aware of its place in the universe is just extraordinary. And we really mustn't forget that. And, biologists, I think, shouldn't forget that. So I think it's a good thing actually to start not by trying to sort of go into the, non-living bits of life, the genes and so on. We have to get that there eventually and find a good story to tell about them, but to really make sure that we don't lose sight that we start off from the absolutely wonderful nature of life itself and to allow ourselves to be, awed by that because we really should be.
Thank you so much. The last is not a question, is a advice I need from you. We are selecting a name for the translation of your book in Farsi. So my colleague Reza Amir, who translated this to Farsi, put like a poll for people to vote to see what we can translate this book to Farsi, not exactly translating word by word, like how life works, because it's a sentence. We want to use like a wording. If you want to select another title for your book, not how life works, or you have any recommendation we can use for a title of Farsi, it might be hard. You can email me if you want, but we are thinking maybe about how we are alive, something like that, or a little bit different than the title exact translation. If you want to choose a few more titles for your book, what do you choose? We can see maybe if we can translate that to Farsi.
Right. Well, maybe I should think about that a little. I mean, what I wouldn't choose, because it might be tempting, there have been several books, one most famously written by the physicist Erwin Schrödinger called
Yeah.
What is Life? And I start off, yeah, I mean, no, because I'm not
No, we don't
explaining
want
what
them
life
with that.
is.
Yeah.
It is a different question because I'm saying, well, here's life. How does it work? We don't have to, think about what it is. So absolutely. But the what you said there about, how are we alive? I mean, it's more something like of that kind of nature. How does it come to be that we are that this is
Mm.
what we are? And so I want to sort of convey that idea. Um, yeah, it's off the top of my head. I think
Please
I will.
write to me, Dr. Bal.
I
If
will
you
do
rem
that.
if you suggest or something come to your mind, we want to be scientifically true, and
Mm.
also for public is absorbing, so the book can be get attention, and then we can maybe also go to market. So I think we currently have the how we are alive kind of for the title for now, but we are working with the publisher in Iran to see what we can come. But if you think about anything that might be also relates to what you discuss in your book, please write to me or through Talia, you can send me, and I would be happy to transfer to the Iranian publisher who is publishing your book.
Sure, I will put my mind to that and see what I
Okay.
can do.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. It has been a deeply enlightening conversation for me. It was a great pleasure for me to see an amazing feature like a person in science and also communication. So it was good. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. Hopefully, after the publication, I send you an email and then inform you that the book is published.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mehdi. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you so much. I will send you a link to this video after I edit it. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Okay.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
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 Bye.